So let me just say, happy Sunday to everybody. I'm Zach Rhodes here from Burlington, Vermont, and I'm here with the founder of the Life Process Program, Dr. Stanton Peel. Stanton, great to be with you.
My pleasure entirely, Zach.
Let me tell you that I got on last Sunday morning, I got a text message from my mother that said, "Hey, your next podcast, you should talk about Demi Lovato." And then I got a text message from my father, who I think was probably sitting a couple of feet away from her, but they didn't communicate. He said, "Hey, you should do your next Sunday morning episode on Demi Lovato." And I got an email from you about 5 minutes later saying the same thing. So I think it's in the cards for us that we discuss something that, Demi Lovato, and I'll let you tell the story, did overcome a drug addiction and a near-death experience, at least one. And she talked about sort of, when it comes to, let's say, compared to the mainstream, a unique way of overcoming her addiction. But to me and you, it seems like a very commonsensical way. And I think what we'll do is sort of thread the same needle we always do, where not only is her method of overcoming addiction not so unique to us, but the thing that it's aspiring to do, the story is aspiring to do, which says, like, you don't need to be abstained from everything and lock yourself in a prison. Maybe doesn't even go far enough. But and at the same time, her critics will say, well, how could you say something like that? You're too radical. You're insulting all of us. So that's just, let's say, an intro to what I'd love you to talk about now.
Well, I think all of those topics come up in regards to Demi Lovato in terms of some responses. Let me just say the best thing about that story with your mother and father is, well, at least they know what you're about.
Yeah, they know it. Yeah, for sure.
When Carl Hart was interviewed in the New York Times about taking drugs, I got 2 emails saying, "Hey, Dad, take a look at this," from my son Dana and my daughter Ada. So I figured, okay, at least, So Demi Lovato was interviewed on the CBS Sunday morning show in preparation for her documentary, which has begun already, called Dancing with the Devil, I think. And her story is that she was sober in the conventional way for 6 years until 2017. And when she went off being sober, she went haywire. She took everything. She took cocaine and meth and heroin and drank and marijuana, every drug you could think of. So it wasn't just a step back into life. It was a full-blown relapse. And in 2018, she had a near fatal, she was turning blue with heroin and fentanyl. And now she's reemerged. And in that Sunday morning show, she announced that she's California sober, which means that she smokes marijuana and she drinks. It's CBS Sunday morning. Lovato has endured 2 highly publicized relapses and suffered 3 strokes and a heart attack. She's only about 29, so that's, worse than average. Lovato talked about her current stage of recovery, and CBS's Smith asked her to elaborate on the moderation approach to recovery. So you're doing what they call moderation, I guess, right? So you're drinking, smoking a little bit of weed. Is that fair to say? Smith asked the interviewer. Smoking a little bit of weed. It makes it sound like, I'm not accusing Smith of anything, that she's familiar with the practice. You know what I mean? Now, here's one of the comments. D. Lovato, I want to let you know you are not a role model for recovery from opiates. Your claim that you are California sober is an insult. A stroke, brain damage, blindness, and hearing loss, and you still drink, such a waste of talent. So there's somebody who's not seeing this as a positive development. And then I subsequently saw a commentator on Access Hollywood, which is the main entertainment daily show. And he actually was some kind of a therapist. I would guess he's a recovery guy. And he spoke about harm reduction. So harm reduction is mainstream. I mean, let's take one step back and say our whole purpose in doing this series, as you mentioned, is to suggest alternative narratives. Mm-hmm. And those alternative narratives are really the standard way of doing things. Most people cut back on drinking, perhaps not always with drugs like heroin. Well, she didn't cut back heroin. She switched to, a drug that most people find more manageable. And so the commenter talked about harm reduction, but it's hard to describe his attitude. He was sort of saying, well, if, it can be done. And then he sort of said, but, I'm striving for abstinence. Mm-hmm. But he really missed her point. And, I despair sometimes. We talked about how for many people in the reform movement, harm reduction has come to mean MAT. And our attitude is harm reduction means living your life better, whether or not you're using drugs or that particular drug, your problem drug or any other drug. We're not looking to, harm reduction isn't, well, you're still using drugs. That's the thing. That's not reducing harm necessarily. So in this case, he's saying that her solution is sort of, he's envisioning as a path to abstinence. But that's not what she's saying. She basically, her message, Demi Lovato is not a social scientist or a commentator, you have to listen to her and, sort through what she's saying. She was saying that following another path, somebody else's path to recovery, didn't work for her. Mm-hmm. And the reason I say that is, one thing she said was, one size doesn't fit all. She said that by way of saying, thank God I'm not telling everybody else to do this, but this is what I did. But then she didn't liken herself to Britney Spears, but it's really worth contrasting her to Britney Spears. She said, I did this as a part of taking control of my life. And she mentioned specifically, she's still in her 20s. Britney Spears is, as we talked about, made a documentary framing Britney Spears. The New York Times made it. It's all these issues are becoming so mainstream. Her life has been totally in control of a conservatorship of our fathers for 13 years. Lovato doesn't mention Britney Spears, but it's almost as though she was directly contrasting herself to her. She said, her diet was controlled, Lovato's, mm-hmm. because, these people, they want to look a certain way. Mm-hmm. And Lovato and Spears, are no longer thin striplings of young women. And so she took control of her diet. She's the receivership that Spears is in, it's very much around finances. Lovato said she's taking control of her own finances. Obviously, some young artist or singer, doesn't know about business. So that's something you have to learn about. And so she's saying she took control of her own recovery. And she used some kind of an analogy. I didn't, it's not written down in the descriptions I've read. She was led to water, she said, and made to drink it, which is a little bit of a funny simile because she was led to water and told not to drink it. But her point, I think, is, you can, the saying is you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink it. She's saying you can't be directed towards your own recovery. Mm-hmm. Somebody can't say, oh, here, do this.
What you need to do, right?
Take MAT, don't drink. She's come up with her own. And her own, she feels she'll be happier smoking marijuana and drinking some alcohol.
You've introduced in a lot of your writing the idea of iatrogenic harm. So you go into a hospital setting and it's that you could have been okay if you just were left to your own devices, but actually maybe you got some sort of infection while you were in the hospital or something. There weren't precautions taken. We're kind of fighting against journocentric harm, where the mainstream media stories are actually doing the harm. And so people's ideas about what they need to do or what they need to lead other people to do, that come from, because people aren't experts, and they really don't know much about, they might think they know what addiction is, because it's just such a nice little way of conceptualizing it, to have a couple media stories that you remember and say, okay, that's what it is. And Demi Lovato saying, I kind of followed all that and I let people lead me to that. But as it turns out, there's whatever wacky little way I figured out, it kind of works for me. I just, it's in balance with my life.
It's funny you should say that, because the expert is talking to the host of Access Hollywood, one of whom is Mario Lopez. I don't know that much about him. He was sort of a TV kid star. He seems to be fairly self-possessed human being. I know he has a couple of kids, and I'm thinking he knows more than the expert he's consulting with. If I were to talk to Mario Lopez, I would say, do you expect your kids never to drink or smoke marijuana? And, he has to say, well, no. And then I might say to him, I'm just making all this up, I don't know the man at all. What's the best guarantee you're going to have that they end up, you've seen people probably go off the skids with, those drugs and others. You seem to have maintained your balance. How would you go about making sure that they're able to handle all of that?
Mm-hmm.
And I think he would say, well, I want them to learn to make their own decisions. I want them to be able to, enjoy life. I want them to respect themselves and to be healthy. He would talk in terms of basic values, and he would give a model of harm reduction, I think, as a sensible human being, which is what you're saying is, which I agree with. We have a whole superstructure of dealing with addiction, which is worse than common sense that most sensible human beings figure out on their own. If anybody wants to search my name and Oprah, I did it. There's a 3-part series of me being on Oprah in 1987, and it's a little unique. Oprah was sort of on my side. And the audience was mainly, obviously, recovering people. And when people would say, oh, I got sober through recovery, I would, in every case, ask them about it. I'd say, can you tell me more about it? And not one of their stories felt the standard AA scenario. Like one guy said, oh, well, I quit, and after a while I joined AA. Nobody, not one person in the audience who supposedly represented recovery in the mainstream actually told the recovery narrative. And so for our story, Stories for Sunday, is about how people force themselves into that mold that is not true, and it's often more often than not detrimental, and that people have to find their own true lodestar. And God bless her, Demi Lovato is not, the social, she's not she's a performer, singer, has come to that realization on her own. Well, I was led, I think she put it, I was led to the well. I think that's how she described it. And so she's actually coming to the point, I had to come up with my own form of recovery for it to be true to me and to work.
And of course, some people are taking this as, I think you just read a comment from Twitter. Some people are taking this like as a slur, or like thumb in your nose at people who have had to expend effort, who care about their lives, who don't, who wouldn't be so destructive as to do something like drink or whatever she's doing. And I get charged with this all the time, of course. It's like I almost died. That's how much I wanted to do heroin, that I almost died doing it. And then I continue to do it even after that. I don't know what it takes to get to the point where people allow you to be actually addicted. I think what it takes is either doing what they say is necessary to recover or not. But why do you think that people have this idea that something like heroin can't be done? Let me ask it another way, actually. There are some people, let's say Carl Hart, who can do heroin and have no problem with it. And a lot of people will be like, okay, I guess it's, some people can do that, but not everyone. Some people are, prone to being a Demi Lovato. And so she could never go back to heroin. I think she believes that she couldn't, and she probably just doesn't want to. It's not giving her that experience anymore. But of course, that has nothing to do with the drug. It has more to do with the relationship of the drug. And I'm Wondering if you could speak about that phenomenon a little bit and the misunderstanding.
I mean, I'm doing my memoir, and the person who most resembled me before me, if you turn to Norman Zinberg's entry in Wikipedia, it mentions me in the first sentence describing him. He actually did a study, formerly addicted, currently moderate users of heroin. And in my memoir, I say, come on, do you believe that? I mean, and you know, there are people that happens for, and obviously their life changes sufficiently that that's the way they're going to use the drug. And so the point, all of those things are possible, but people have to be aware of themselves enough, mindful enough of themselves to be able to be aware of that. The recovery model is you don't know this. So you'll think that you're taking, drinking or taking heroin and you're not addicted, but you've deluded yourself. I mean, I guess that happens. But the point of the matter is that you can be aware of whether you're improving or not improving. And you can be aware that that experiment is working now or it's not working. And you can decide, well, you know, I better go back to abstinence. And, you know, maybe in the future, there's no rule that you won't be able to return to it. I mean, the example I always use is the great Irish actor, oh, for God's sake, I'm going to block out his name, but I'll come up with it. He almost died in his, I think, 40s from a combination of cocaine and alcohol. And then he, in his 70s, he was still acting. And he's Irish, and he went back to Ireland to film. And he said, here I am above the grave, and all my relatives are thinking, and he's not having a Guinness. So he started going to the bar and having a Guinness. Now you might say, okay, he's a grandfather, for God's sake. He's 70. No wonder he can have a Guinness or two at the bar. When he was 40, he'd go crazy. But that's the point. People change in different ways throughout their life, and they become capable of different things. And you have the ability, and you owe it to yourself to kind of examine what your life is like and to make that kind of a decision. We can't tell you. We don't tell anybody to return to anything. I mean, in the Life Process program, your options are yours to choose from. And Demi Lovato's chosen her option.
The idea that, okay, California sober, the idea that that's a fad, it's alcohol and marijuana, the two things that are legal. And I'm thinking, well, she probably doesn't turn back to heroin the same reason I don't, which is not necessarily because I could never tolerate it again. Actually, I could imagine if the drug legalization folk had their way and that's what it looked like, that I would very much enjoy taking heroin if I knew the dose and the good setting. But I would never do it again because it's just, where would I get it? Who would I get it from?
And you're involved in schools, you know, you don't want to be like arrested and have a hood over your face.
Right. So is there drug exceptionalism seeping into that sort of label that she's putting on it? It's like, in some ways, it's great what she's doing, because in the broad sense, she's saying, I kind of took control of my own life and I'm doing something that works out for me. And then on the other hand, not that we're putting it on her that she has to do this, but I'm hesitant to be so happy about the term and the concept, because I see it as, well, marijuana is okay, alcohol is okay, those are the good drugs, and you know, I would never do the bad ones.
We're practicing exceptionalism. That's the term Carl Hart uses. And obviously, the thing that disproves it every day that you and I have gone over, and Carl emphasizes, the opioid molecule is the opioid molecule. It's present in painkillers. And everybody, you know, if you get an operation, you're going to take a painkiller. You know, you're not going to say, oh, you know, my ex-wife got I just told my daughter-in-law this Sunday, she got a root canal when she was pregnant, and she refused any kind of medication, any kind of painkiller. And I happened to be there in the waiting room, and the dentist was begging her. You know, you realize, well, that painkiller is sort of for the dentist. But anyhow, but she didn't want to, she was a purist. She didn't want to mess with the Dana, who was a fetus at the time. But 99% of normal human beings under those kinds of conditions, they'll take a painkiller, nearly always an opioid painkiller, and they don't get addicted to that because it's in a different setting and they have a different concept of themselves and of what the medication is. So people who would deny ever practicing harm reduction, all kinds of recovering people, of course, that's harm reduction.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm using it for a purpose. I'm not going to get addicted. I'm in the hospital. I'm not going to get my appendix removed without a narcotic painkiller. Are you nuts? And then, they'll tell you later, well, I've abstained, certainly from drugs and from narcotics for, 10 or 20 years. And then you say, well, except, and then they'll say, oh, sure, but that doesn't count. And harm reduction is a way of saying, well, when is the situation different enough? And when am I different enough that, we erase the chalkboard and we say, this is how we're going to do it this time.
As I say, I wouldn't expect any particular human being to want to go the distance with that understanding. We're happy that she's able to make determinations on her own and live a good life. But it's always in the back of my mind. Like, are we going to stop there? Is the thing that reduces people's dissonance about her story, insofar as it even did for some people, that those things are legal and those are the okay ones? But anyway, we'll leave it up.
Well, that's why, God bless Carl Hart. I mean, he's like a incredibly prominent, high status figure. And he says, drugs are drugs. They're not addiction.
Yeah.
And that's true of any drug you happen to want to care about or focus on or want to take. And so he's saying even the standard harm reduction rules, he didn't say that explicitly, but they're too limited. Harm reduction means using substances of any kind in a less harmful way and with some benefits, as he points out. And they can happen with the same person. Does Carl talk much about, I don't think Carl talks about people who were formerly addicted and now take drugs. I don't think that's a topic he gets.
No, well, at least not in the book. I mean,
I've never heard
everything about his work, but
and in a way,
that's interesting.
God bless Carl Hart, but Norman Zinberg was saying, 30 years ago, was saying something more radical. And Carl's saying, well, I take heroin, and people say, oh, you're a professor, blah, 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 blah. And Norman Zinberg was saying, well, there are people that used to be addicted for one reason or another, and now they've got like a job or children, and so they only shoot up on weekends. So it's a harm reduction for society. In other words, America is starting to be willing to hear this story. Mm-hmm. And that's, I mean, when I was blown away during the anti-controlled drinking episode in the early 80s, when Mary Pendry and her colleagues, described the study that had shown people taught to control drink did better than those who abstained, which they never disproved. They just looked at the controlled drinkers and they said, well, look at all these relapses. And the Sobel said, well, we had all those relapses. It's just that the people taught only abstinence relapsed a lot more. Mm-hmm. So, in a way, we're only circling back just more radical things that came out before their time. So I guess maybe I can get into this. This is not the AARP features George Clooney, who's just about turning 60.
Yeah, and by the way, I wonder if there's an age where, I mean, that means he's some like 25 years older than me or so. Is there some age where I will be as good looking as him just by virtue of his aging out? I don't know.
Well, he's aged well. Everybody likes that silver hair. But there's somebody else in the magazine, Tony Bennett, who I think is 94 now. And let me start with Tony Bennett's story and how Tony Bennett got in trouble talking about drugs. In 2011, Tony Bennett talked about how drugs almost killed him. He was a cocaine guy. And here's how he got better. Tony Bennett has revealed how he was saved from drowning in his bath after a cocaine binge during a period in his life when he was broke and, quote, drug-addled. He used the word addled rather than addicted. I owed $1.2 million, which was a fortune in those days. It's a fair amount of money now. He wrote this in 2011 when he was 84. I felt as if I was going crazy. I turned more and more recklessly to drugs for relief. And he was further devastated when his mother Ann died on Thanksgiving Day in 1977. I felt as if I was going crazy. I turned more and more recklessly to drugs for relief. So how did he wrote this when he was 84. I think he's 94 now, so that would have been about 2012. Yeah, this was done in 2012. How did he get better? This is what he said in 2012. His life was finally brought under control when his rocker son Danny stepped in to help settle his debts. That's one way to go. If you have 1.2, I guess his son's doing pretty well. Today he says the drugs are long gone, a distant memory. I'm healthier now than I ever have been. He's also married to his third wife, former school teacher Susan Crow, who's 40 years younger than him. Now, I've made this comment a million times. I mean, so he's had some ups and downs, Tony Bennett. He's on his third wife, c'est la vie, not for us to judge. He was near the bottom. He said he almost died. He was, over $1 million in debt. And now I think it helps him to be happy to say, boy, I really had a bad period back then. Things are good now. I'm not making a joke when I say having been addicted in some form or having had some complete collapse is one way of getting a perspective on life. It makes you more humane. It makes you more empathic, and it makes you appreciate what you've got now. So then in 2012, that story was 2011. Tony Bennett got in trouble in 2012. Bennett made some waves Saturday night at Clive Davis's annual pre-Grammys party, which was a memorial for Whitney Houston, after the singer was found dead in her hotel room hours earlier. On stage, Bennett called for drug legalization. Once it's legal, there's no longer the desire, says Grammy-winning singer. What can you say? I mean, Tony Bennett's a guy who tried, he's not in the business of being controversial.
Mm-hmm.
He's trying to win awards, and he's a very easygoing guy. People love him. He's a lovable guy. And he gave his opinion at a Grammy ceremony. He said, if they legalized drugs, I think we'd all be better off, and maybe she'd still be alive. So I get AARP. He's 94 now. I think he may have dementia.
Yeah, I've heard that.
But he was singing into his 90s. So he had a good ride there. And they're giving a retro vision of his life. They never mentioned cocaine. So one of the stories that we're telling is, you never hear these stories. Tony Bennett, in 1977, when his mother died, was $1.2 million in debt. And he was going crazy with cocaine. He almost drowned, which is, I think, how Whitney Houston died.
Mm-hmm.
And then his son helped him pay it off, and he got married again. And hopefully this marriage is working well for him. He got back into singing. I think he was making pretty good money there. And so he stopped taking cocaine, and that's just like a distant memory for him. And this is AARP. I guess I don't know what they would say. Well, we're not in the business of going over people's dirty laundry, but that's a part of his life. It's a part of how he's gotten to be who he is. And they're not going to talk about it in the AARP back look at at Tony Bennett's life. And so we're back to the story of God bless Demi Lovato for telling her story now.
Mm-hmm.
And she tells it directly. You'd get to do that more. And people were watching it, and she made a documentary. So she's telling her story unfiltered. This is my story, take it or leave it. But they're ignoring Tony Bennett's story. But they tell a lot about George Clooney. But they don't mention the word in the cover story, they don't mention alcohol. And George Clooney's story has alcohol in it. In 2012, George Clooney said, "I drink at times too much," the actor revealed. "I do enjoy drinking, and there have been times in my life when it's crossed the line from being fun to having to drink late at night for absolutely no reason. So what I do is I stop. I haven't had a drink since New Year's Eve," he said in 2012. Okay. Now, George Clooney has a different life than you and me. You've mentioned how good looking he is. I've seen other interviews with him. He has a very nice house. By the way, and well, I'll jump forward to 2020. He's married to a beautiful woman named Emma Clooney, who's a international rights legal activist. I believe she's an attorney. But in 2017, George Clooney did something we're not likely to do. He had started a tequila company.
That's right. Yeah.
And he sold it to Diageo with his partners for $700 million. And I read that he and his partners had put in quite a bit of money. They had put in together $700,000, but that's a big $700 million. And you're sort of thinking, probably George Clooney didn't have financial problems like Tony Bennett to start with. As part of the deal, the actor and his co-owners also stand to make an additional $300 million if the tequila continues to sell like hotcakes over the next, he had a lawyer who had a riser clause in it. So that adds up to $1 billion. In 2020, George Clooney started a family with Emma Clooney at the age of 56. So he's only, I think, 59 now. He'd started the family earlier than 2020, I should say. The National Enquirer had an article in 2020 that said this: George Clooney's health scare while preparing for the Midnight Sky had plenty of people worried, including his wife, Amo. One outlet reports that in the aftermath of his hospitalization, he also, he was interviewed. He also had a bad motorcycle accident. An outlet reports in the aftermath of the hospitalization, she ordered him to stay sober, I think meaning abstinent, much to his displeasure. In the magazine, it said, and what she said to him was, "You have a family now." In the magazine, it says, she said that to him and he stopped riding his motorcycle. What he abstains from now is driving a motorcycle. He got in a really serious accident. So the National Enquirer had an article in 2020 in December. Clooney's dry spell makes Amo's life hell. The irritable actor has been squabbling with his wife over his drinking habit. His wife was all over him about ditching his drinking after he was hospitalized. She wants him to take care of himself so he can properly take care of his family. Okay, fair enough. George was stricken with pancreatitis after losing weight for his latest movie. George, meanwhile, has been forcing himself to go along with it despite jonesing for his evening cocktail and growing frustration. He feels better and looks great, but he's been a real pain in the butt. Even Emil is looking forward to when he can safely have a couple of drinks again. That's a lot going on there.
Yeah.
So either he was hospitalized, possible pancreatitis, or in the magazine, it says motorcycle accident. Under either of those circumstances, perhaps he could stop drinking. The magazine does not mention alcohol at all. I have seen him interviewed, And he says he has a separate room that he goes to. And he says, oh, I have a drink here, and it's got, his books and his paraphernalia. I'm sure he's a good father, but so now in 2021, in a recent interview with Good Morning America, host George Stephanopoulos asked the actor how he was making it through quarantine with his two toddlers. To which George Clooney replied with a smile, well, I drink mostly, George, I drink. Obviously, he was joking, but the actor hasn't become an award season teetotaler. So I don't know 100% what that's supposed to mean, except, he's joking about drinking, but he does drink. And I'm guessing he seems to, the magazine says he takes every so often, he takes a vacation with his wife, to free up his time. And, he stopped riding his motorcycle. He's made certain adjustments in life. But he still drinks alcohol. So he's had this long history. We went back to a 2011 quote where he said, oh, sometimes I drink too much. Then there was something about stopping drinking after his or during his hospitalization, which we can all understand. But now it seems as though it's understood in his household by himself and his wife. He has two small children. He has obligations. He doesn't drive a motorcycle, but he still drinks alcohol. And, late at night, maybe that's important to him. But I quoted George Stephanopoulos, that was on Good Morning America, AARP magazine. I hope they're not going to cancel my subscription or my membership. By the way, for those of you who don't know, and you might not know, you can join AARP when you turn 50 years old. I belong to AARP for 25 years now. So, I'm already an old member of AARP. They didn't think in discussing Tony Bennett, who had a significant cocaine thing, and George Clooney, where alcohol has sort of been an issue around his life, for a while, 10 or 20 years. They didn't think it was worthwhile mentioning those things. And, AARP has, I think, 75 million members, a tremendous number. I don't know, wouldn't that be something worth discussing? Maybe some other people, they were sitting there thinking, I used to have a drug problem, am I okay? Some of them are thinking, I'd like a drink tonight. Is that wrong? Maybe I've drunk too much in the past, or maybe, I'm 50 or 60 or 70. Am I allowed to do that? But that's not something they're going to discuss. His children, vacationing with his wife, Tony Bennett's dementia, but they're not going to discuss drugs and alcohol.
It's another, you can never go wrong not mentioning it. Right.
That's their logic. I mean, they have tens of millions of members. I guess they're going to start writing and complaining. What do you mean? Mm-hmm. Drink. They're another group, I guess, that, their basic goal is not to be controversial. Their job's not to get into fights with some portion of their membership. But it's another, thing. You're not allowed to talk about it. What we began by saying is the non-standard story is the standard story. Mm-hmm. There are more non-standard stories than the stories that we're supposed to hear, which is, you become addicted or an alcoholic, boom, you're done. You can't integrate it back into your life. But people negotiating substance use, it's not becoming less common. In fact, people keep writing about it during the pandemic. They're worried about older people drinking and taking drugs more. The New York Times had an article about, older people. They're worried now about older people smoking marijuana. So the natural stories of how to deal with this, they're all over the place. They're the most prominent people, the ones that they're probably most of the people that they're going to interview have some story to tell. It's almost as though they could end every interview with, tell us about your drug and alcohol history. Our readers would be interested. Very few people would not have something to say in that part of the interview. And most of what they would say is, well, I'm probably in better shape. Well, if they're an older person, they'll probably say, well, I'm in better shape now than I used to be. Here's how I did that. Perhaps that would be helpful.
So we've got a few threads there in a really short amount of time. But we had Demi Lovato telling her story now and putting it front and center, which we laud her for sure. Tony Bennett, who had to backlog, you sort of had to do a paper trail on him to be able to get a reasonable story about his drug use and how he overcame it and
I
his
was
ideas
aware of
about
his drug.
legalization.
It's something I had stored in my mental files. Yes.
And well, I just mean in your explaining it, it's like in order to send people to the correct links to follow up on you, you had to zigzag across
couple decades.
Exactly. And then of course there's George Clooney. That, as you say, I guess to wrap it all up, the non-standard story is the standard story. The stories we don't hear is what happens. It's commonplace. It's not. People are complicated. People are imperfect. Drug use is a natural sort of way of dealing with the world. Not everyone who uses drugs becomes addicted to them, and even when they have blips, they can figure out what to do with those with that on their own. You never really know what's percolating in someone's mind that leads them to make one decision or another about the way that they conduct their lives.
And two things I'd add to that. Of course, there's the pandemic, which everybody says is enhancing people's likelihood of taking drugs. And I wrote a piece for Filter, like alcohol works for me during the pandemic. But even the pandemic aside, drugs and alcohol aren't disappearing. And if anything, the Demi Lovato story, one thing about it is she took a lot of different drugs. People are not being exposed less to drugs nowadays. Mm-hmm. That's not happening. So that's one story that, we wanted to tell everybody. And here's the other story, for your own personal edification or entertainment, you could fill in where AARP that leaves off. You can ask virtually, certainly if you're at a table at dinner, if that ever happens again, you can say, oh, I've been curious, I've been thinking about this. Have any of you ever been addicted? Or, for example, did any of you ever smoke? How did you quit and why did you quit? Or, maybe if it's a more intimate group, you can say, tell me about do you mind talking about your drug and alcohol history? And the stories will be long and entwining and curvilinear. And virtually nobody's going to tell you some kind of recovery story. Oh, I drank until I was 22. I mean, if she was sober for 6 years at 28, so she quit drinking or whatever, or taking drugs at 22, is that really going to last until she's 80? Is that
right? The key is to try to make sure you're not asking somebody who's indebted themselves to the recovery community, or somebody who has lived a life but maybe doesn't. This is not front and center of their life stories. And
so you have to get and again, Demi Lovato's our new hero. Most people, there's a million stories like that. The people who used to drink a ton, I've read them all in my life. Robert Redford had a bad period when he was in France, when he was getting drunk every night, and he's not going to talk about it now. Mm-hmm. Why get into it? Mm-hmm. There's a million stories like that. And you don't hear about them, except, they're coming forward a little bit more and you could ask about them. The recovery narrative is done. I reviewed in my memoir, there was a review of 6 recovery books, and every one of the stories was a non-recovery story. Even though they were called recovery books, not one person did the actual recovery thing. And so we're in a period where people are, during our lifetimes, are opening up about the multi-dimensional ways that people use drugs and stop using drugs and moderate their use of drugs. And that has to be viewed as a good thing.
Excellent. Good way to end it. Stanton, thanks for your time today, and everybody enjoy your Sunday.
Au revoir.